Well, we've made it to Good Friday, Friday of Holy Week, and of course, the day that we commemorate the suffering and death of Jesus just following the Passover. Today, I want to focus on a striking moment in the story of Jesus' trials that led directly to his crucifixion. You remember he was tried by Jewish authorities, and then he was tried by the Roman authorities, and specifically Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor appointed by Caesar to govern that part of Israel. And for this, I want to go to John chapter 19, and we're entering into the Pilate part of the story, kind of toward the end. Jesus has already been flogged. He's been horribly beaten. He's been interrogated by Pilate. But now, I'm going to pick it up in John 19, starting in verse 6. When the chief priests and the temple servants saw Jesus, when Pilate brought him out after he was flogged, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate responded, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him." "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, and these were the Jewish religious leaders talking. "And according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" But Jesus said this to him, "You would have no authority over me at all if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him, but the Jews shouted, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. And he told the Jews, "Here is your king." They shouted, take him away, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king?" "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Then he handed him over to be crucified. What a striking moment in the history of Israel. Jesus has already been beaten almost beyond recognition. He's been flogged terribly. He's bleeding all over. And Pilate brings him out and says, "I can't find any reason to condemn this man." But the Jews won't have it. They just won't hear of it. They keep saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." He thinks he's the Son of God, and that scares Pilate even more. He's already thinking this is not right, but now, what if this is really some sort of a god? And it scares Pilate. He wants to release him, but the Jews invoke Caesar. They say in verse 12, "If you release this man, you're not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king, like Jesus, the King of the Jews, opposes Caesar." And so they really backed Pilate into a corner. Pilate doesn't want to look like he's excusing political rebellion, and he doesn't want things to get worse between him and the Jewish people for fear that Caesar will relieve him of his post as governor. But he can't let it go. He kind of goads the people. He brings Jesus out and he says, "Here's your king. You really want me to crucify your king?" And that brings us to this shocking moment that really is the breaking point in the gospel story that John tells. In verse 15, tragically, the chief priests, it specifies that it was the chief priests who said this. They said, "We have no king but Caesar." In order to protect their power, in order to keep themselves comfortable, in order to be able to pursue their own desires, the Jews were willing to finally and fully reject their own Messiah and embrace the rule of a pagan king. It's tragic, isn't it? There isn't any list of practical applications here. Like at the end of a sermon when we list out, kind of some applications. There's just a sobering truth that I want us to think about here on this Good Friday. After all that God did for Israel, think about our study in the book of Exodus. After all that God did for Israel, they were so committed to their own desires, to their own lusts, that they were willing to reject their Messiah and embrace the rule of a pagan king. And as easy as it is for us to look at them and say, that was really dumb, and imply that we wouldn't have done the same thing, the fact is we are all the same people. We are all just like those chief priests. We want to, by nature, we want to embrace our own desires and reject our divine King, Jesus. Aren't you glad that Jesus came to save us from that? Through his death and his resurrection, he saves us from our own desires, from our own sin. I hope you'll rejoice in that with me this weekend.